A philosophy of philosophy? I've always been very interested in philosophy, and even in my teenage years, I was reading some fairly light philosophy. And particularly during my studies of theology, I became even more interested in it, especially when I was doing my PhD in theology. Theologians will usually draw upon the philosophical concepts of the day to try to interpret theological elements. So, for example, at one stage, theologians would appeal to the philosophy of Plato or perhaps Aristotle. At another time, it might be an appeal to the existentialist philosophers of the 20th century. So, anyway, in writing my PhD thesis in theology, it felt very much like an exercise in philosophy as well, and I was reading a great deal of philosophy at the time. One of the philosophies that appealed to me back then was something called process philosophy. And in 1927, an English professor of mathematics and philosophy gave a series of lectures called the Gifford Lectures in the University of Edinburgh. And he published these in a book that was called Process and Reality. And at the time, that book, when it went into print, when it was published, it was filled with a lot of mistakes. The publishers couldn't understand Whitehead's handwriting, and he had no interest whatsoever in proofreading. And it was published in Britain and it was published in the US, and the two editions were often quite different. They interpreted the mistakes differently or incorporated different mistakes. And it was only much later that a corrected edition of Process and Reality was created. I'm not sure how it was created exactly, but possibly people went back to Whitehead's notes or to the lectures themselves or to notes made by others at the lectures or to earlier versions of the book that Whitehead himself wrote. Anyway, they constructed a corrected version of the book. Now, I didn't read the whole book at the time, though I did quote it in places. But I did get an inkling recently to go back and maybe read it. Now, I'm not sure whether I will actually do that because I think it will be a very, very challenging experience. Philosophical books, particularly of the speculative kind that is, are very difficult to understand, and you need quite an extensive background in philosophy to understand them. I'm probably fooling myself to think that I can actually do that. Nevertheless, I have been toying with the idea whether I'm willing to spend the money on the Kindle version of the book and take that chance. I'm not sure. Anyway, that's all, in a sense, a bit of an aside because what it got led me to thinking was, well, what is the nature of philosophy itself? So, in a way, that's a kind of meta philosophical question. It's asking what is philosophy? What is a philosophy? A philosophy, if you like. Well, speculative philosophy, and here I'm going to quote actually from Whitehead himself from his lectures. Speculative philosophy is the endeavor to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted. So basically, it's an attempt to understand the entirety of reality and our experience of it. There's a couple of terms in Whitehead's definition which I think are important. One is logical. So the system has to hold together logically. One idea leads logically to another. There can't be uh, illogical or irrational jumps, if you like. And some would say that this actually excludes the concept of God, though some philosophers would probably include God in their systems. Some would argue that it actually excludes the idea of God because that's an irrational or non rational element that creeps in. The other word that's used in his definition is necessary. Now, that's intriguing because clearly, in one sense, a philosophical system doesn't come up with necessary truths because philosophy changes all the time. There are so many philosophers, they each develop their own particular system, they develop their own coherent logical system, in what sense can it be argued that they're necessary? Well, they may not be necessary, but they aim to be. That is to say that these are not just random ideas that the person came up with in their own mind, but they are actually necessary to understand the world around us and our experience. So, necessary here, I guess, is used in an opposite sense from, for instance, arbitrary. They're not arbitrary ideas, they actually are necessary, they're inbuilt into the reality that we're trying to study. They're also not contingent. They're not fleeting. They're not just momentary occurrences. They are actually part of the essence of what we're trying to understand, of the reality that we're trying to understand. So that's what philosophy is trying to do. It's trying to build up this big, coherent, all-inclusive understanding of reality, of the nature of reality and the nature of our experience of reality. Sometimes the lines blur between philosophy and science. And if you read Aristotle, for example, sometimes he seems to be speaking about the real world and physical processes, and other times he's talking about really abstract ideas. And he didn't necessarily make a distinction between those. Philosophy and physics were very closely interrelated. And in many ways, in the 20th century, that became true again in a new way with ideas such as general relativity and even more so quantum physics. And you get physicists such as Heisenberg actually writing philosophical books because the boundaries between physics and philosophy are indeed sometimes blurred. But the aim of philosophy then is to construct this overall conception of what reality is, how we perceive reality, how we understand and construct reality in our minds. Now, sometime around the middle of the 20th century, this kind of speculative philosophy became rather unpopular. It was considered irrelevant, just a mind game, and philosophy turned its attention to much more practical questions like the structure of language, for example, and the nature of physical reality. But I've always been interested in this speculative philosophy, which I guess is one reason why I was drawn to theology itself at one stage. Now, maybe these questions are really quite irrelevant. I guess they are irrelevant to everyday life. Nevertheless, they force themselves upon me, these questions, and I love to think about them. But what really is the end product of a speculative philosophy? What is its relationship to knowledge? What is its relationship to the world around it? Is it merely a mental exercise and therefore not really relevant? Well, I think what in the end speculative philosophy does is that it builds a new mythology. Consider, for instance, the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. It no longer sees reality in terms of objects, in terms of things. Instead, it sees them in terms of process. So there are no longer static objects, but there are processes that develop through time. So, really, if the old mythology is that the world is made up of solid bits of stuff that come together, the new mythology that process philosophy develops is of the world as a place of movement, of process, as change, not static objects, but motion. So I would suggest that that is, in fact, a new mythology of reality. And in fact, in some ways, it draws its inspiration from physics because it becomes clear with quantum physics that reality is not, in fact, a whole bunch of solid objects that fit together. Atoms, electrons, protons, these are all not so much solid objects as waveforms. And what are waveforms? But movements over time. So from process philosophy emerges a new mythology. Now, I don't know whether I'll get around to reading Process and Reality by Alfred North Whitehead. Probably not. But I do love thinking about these ideas, and I hope you do too.